Welcome everyone, to those of you here in the room at the Robert Schuman Center, and also welcome to everyone online who is watching us on YouTube. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our MPC seminar, which is entitled Migrant Student Achievement, Academic Resilience and Policy Reform During the Pandemic. Today, we are welcoming Professor Luis Volante, who is a professor of education governance and policy analysis at Brock University and a professorial fellow at the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance. He is also the president of CSSE, which stands for the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. Luis' research is primarily focused on global education governance, comparative education policy, international education surveys and policy diffusions, and impact evaluation of policies and programs. So we are very much looking forward to your presentation, Luis, and please, whenever you are ready. Thank you. So meanwhile, I might also remind everyone that our next seminar will be actually already this Wednesday with Valentina Di Stasio, which is also here present in the room. And we are very much looking forward also to that seminar in just 2 days' time. So now, Luis, the floor is yours.
Based on a research grant that was awarded in 2017. It was essentially a 6-year study in which I was working with 2 other additional professors. One you probably might know of. Her name is Melissa Siegel. So she's the head of migration studies in Maastricht University. The other is Don Klinger, who's a dean at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. So the study was designed to look at immigrant student achievement outcomes across all 10 Canadian provinces. I think what's important to recognize about that, the Canadian context, is that education policies are solely the jurisdiction of provincial governments. So there is no federal sort of oversight in the area of education. Why is that important? It's important because all 10 provinces use different educational policy approaches for students, including immigrant students. So it's a nice way of actually having a sense of which policies are working better for certain subgroups of the student population. That's why you see the little disclaimer at the bottom of the first slide, giving credit to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. That's our largest sort of research granting agency in Canada. I'm at Brock University. If you don't know, Brock University is in Southern Ontario. It's on a UNESCO biosphere. It's actually a pretty famous part of the country because it's very rich in ice wine and fruits and vegetables. So it's a very picturesque settings. Not as rolling as Florence, but definitely a nice place to visit. The university is about 20 minutes from Niagara Falls, which is a famous landmark for many people that come from outside. I'm not going to spend too much time on MIPEX because you're probably aware of this, but I will give you a little bit of background context because I think it's relevant to what I'm talking about today. So if you've never heard of MIPEX, you can easily Google it and you can see the different sort of tables that exist for different countries. It looks at migrant integration in the countries that are listed here. It's pretty broad. It's in its 2nd iteration. So we're looking at 2020, which is the most recent iteration. Why did I mention it? Well, you can imagine that 2020 is based on 2019 and earlier data. And I think the reason why that's particularly relevant for the research that I'm wrapping up, as well as some research that I'm going to be doing moving forward, is that it actually captures pre-pandemic sort of educational outcomes for immigrant students. So governments around the world are trying to figure out what's the impact of COVID on educational outcomes for students. And of course, this gives us sort of a benchmark to have an idea of, how different countries were responding to their immigrant student population. So these are the 8 sort of indices, and I've given you the top scores in relation to each of those indices, and then you have your top 5 countries. And I've given you the link at the bottom. I'm not sure you're going to share that. You can share the slides with the participants. But overall, you can see you have a fairly good idea of aggregate scores. So when you see EU 13, they're talking essentially about Western Europe, okay? Eastern Europe, and EU 15 is Western Europe. And then when you have EU 28 is the entire European Union. And then you're looking at the OECD countries, and then the traditional migrant destination countries of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. Now, I rely quite heavily on international achievement data, primarily the OECD PISA data, to look at cognitive outcomes, things like reading, writing, math, science. And they use and they look at achievement gaps in relation to 3 types of populations: boys versus girls, high versus low socioeconomic status students, and they have a scale that they use. And when they say high, they're talking top 25%, and low, they're talking bottom 25%, based on this measure that they've put together to measure socioeconomic status. It is heavily based on parental education levels as a sort of quasi way of gauging socioeconomic status. And I think the reason, for the most part, why we say traditional is because of the relative percentage of the student population. So I'll give you a quick example from where I'm from. I'm Canadian. In Canada, you're looking at around 29.5% of the student population being either a first or second generation immigrant. In Ontario, it's around 40%. In the city of Toronto, it's more than 50%. More than 50% of the kids speak English as a second language. I would be an example of a second generation immigrant because my brothers and my parents were born in Italy. That's not uncommon. Australia and New Zealand also have similar numbers in around 25%. Now, those numbers go a little up and down, but for the most part, you're talking north above 20% of the kids that attend K-12 schools, publicly funded schools, would be part of that group. And as you can see, the higher the immigrant student population, the higher the integration scores. So overall, a general trend, and I'm going to dig more deeper into specifics of certain policies and certain characteristics of immigrant student populations that are sort of correlated or associated with more positive and negative outcomes. I'm mentioning this as well. UNESCO has a really good link, actually. If you click on that link, it'll show you the sheer number of weeks that schools were closed in different countries and the modes of instruction, how many teachers are in the country, how many students are in the country as well. So my colleagues and I are also working on a parallel project. I'll explain it to you at the end, but essentially we're trying to get a sense of the impact of COVID across the European Union in relation to school closures and also the mode of instruction. And then, of course, we're going to disaggregate the data further to focus specifically on immigrant students as well as low SES students in particular. This notion of resilience, I mean, when you think of the word resilience, if you were to pull it up on a dictionary, the classic sort of definition for resilience is the ability to respond to a shock, right? Or a significant disruption. But in the academic literature, particularly in the field of education, resilience means something slightly different. It's really focused primarily on students that are the most at risk for lower educational achievement. And those are primarily two groups. The two groups are immigrant students and low SES students. And we have terms like performance disadvantage to describe immigrant student achievement outcomes relative to their same age peers, whether they're being non-immigrants. So as a general rule of thumb, first-generation immigrants tend to have lower achievement than second-generation immigrants. Second-generation immigrants tend to have lower achievement than non-immigrant students. The European Commission and Eurydice is, if you might have heard of Eurydice, it's basically a statistics and data warehousing site that has statistics for the entire European Union. They frequently publish reports which show immigrant student achievement outcomes across all 28 jurisdictions, and it compares their performance on these international measures, first and second generation immigrants. I gave a presentation similar to today a few years ago in Brussels. And what you found was that immigrants across all countries, with a couple of exceptions, there was a significant performance disadvantage. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what do you mean by how significant of a performance disadvantage? I'll dive into that in the next couple of slides. But I just want you to understand when you hear that term resilience, they're really looking at what we refer to as cognitive achievement outcomes. Now, the research that I'm embarking on is looking at cognitive as well as non-cognitive. I think any person in the room probably can relate to the fact that during COVID, it wasn't just, students didn't just lose opportunities to learn math and science and English. There's significant psychosocial issues that are attached to, being away from their friends, being online all the time. And so we're also starting to look at what are those impacts in terms of non-cognitive outcomes. As a general rule of thumb, those non-cognitive outcomes have always been known to those that work in education and in the field of migration, because as an example, immigrant students are far more likely to get bullied at school, as an example, than non-immigrant students. That doesn't come just from OECD data, that also comes from the IEA, which has parallel assessments. So PISA, you probably heard of, which is the Program in International Student Assessment. It's looking at reading, math, and science for 15-year-olds. It's done on a triennial basis every 3 years. It involves 80 countries, educational jurisdictions, but the IEA also has TIMSS and PEARLS. TIMSS is the Trends in International Mathematics Science Study. PEARLS is the Progress in International Reading and Literacy Study, looking at 9 and 13-year-olds. So we actually have quite a wide range of different data sources to draw on to get a sense of cognitive outcomes, but increasingly those measures are also collecting background data from students, parent questionnaires, teacher questionnaires, looking at other characteristics of their education system and the school setting that are more positively and negatively sort of associated with school outcomes. Melissa, Professor Siegel, and Dr. Klinger and myself, we've been using this sort of theoretical model to explain achievement outcomes for immigrant students. I think the most important thing to understand, first of all, these circles are not to scale, obviously. And of course, they will shrink and expand depending on the country. So a country that has more equitable approaches to immigrant student achievement, you'd see the impact of family background being much smaller than in a country with more inequity. So if I'm using you as an example, if half of my audience is low SES and the other half is high SES, the impact of family would be bigger. What we do from a statistical point of view is we run a regression analysis looking at characteristics of the student population in terms of, single parent, SES, immigrant student, whether first or second generation, and we can look at factors, including the school system. And I'm going to get into those factors in a second. So this is just a general sort of conceptual framework that gives you a sense of the types of things we're looking at. Now, you're probably interested as well on the host society and looking at geopolitical developments as well. Obviously, countries that have a stronger or higher anti-immigrant sentiment, you'd expect students to struggle in those types of national contexts. So that's really important. Now, the national context, the host society issue is a lot harder to capture and measure because there's so many things that go into it. It's a lot easier to control for variables in terms of family background, in terms of the student, in terms of even the school system features, but it's a little bit more difficult to capture that. It's still important. Of course, it's very important. Now, if I had to explain this slide, I could easily spend 3 hours on it, and I'm rest assured I won't do that, so you can breathe easy. But of course, when we look at what I just previously presented, what does the research suggest in terms of achievement outcomes relative to all of these different variables? And of course, some of them are particularly important when we look at migrant students. So as an example, age and country of arrival. If you look cross-nationally, the research is fairly clear that when students arrive in a country after the age of 12, they tend to struggle more than if they arrive in a country prior to 12. Makes perfect sense from a language acquisition point of view. The research is fairly clear. It takes about 5 to 6 years to develop proficiency in a second language. So you can imagine if a student arrives, let's say from, I'll use you as an example, let's say from Czechoslovakia and Italy, and they arrive and they're 15 years old, it's difficult for them to quote unquote catch up before they'd have to move on to post-secondary studies. Okay, so when you're thinking about these variables, such as age of arrival, they do fluctuate from country to country. I wrote a book in 2018. It was published by Springer, has the same title, sort of Migrant Student Achievement Outcomes. It's available. If you're interested, just email me. I'll send you the PDF. But what we found is that the age of arrival, there were differences across countries. So as an example, in Ireland, if you arrived after the age of 10, you were more likely to suffer a performance disadvantage than if you were arriving in Italy after the age of 10. So even though 12 seems to be the magic number, and it kind of makes sense from a point of view when you're looking at secondary education, most secondary education systems seem to finish at the age of 16. So, that's one example. Of course, the country of arrival also makes a difference. So if I take two twins, identical twins, and they're both Turkish, and I send one of those twins to Germany, and I send another one to the Netherlands, they both have the same sort of background characteristics, but the only difference between those two immigrant students, nothing varies except for the country in which they're situated. I would expect the student in the Netherlands to have better educational achievement outcomes than the student going to Germany, right? So that is essentially what we're trying to do with some of this research as much as possible, is kind of control all those background characteristics to isolate within education systems, what is it about that particular system that is making those students more likely to be successful, right? And as an example, if I look at tracking, which is related to school system features, okay, so tracking would be an example of, essentially in Italy, an example of tracking would be the type of secondary school you would attend. So a liceo is designed to have you go on to higher education, whereas a vocational program would be designed to do something different, right? And countries across Europe tend to have tracking at the school level. So, certain high schools, certain secondary schools are designed for university attendance, and others are designed for more career pathways. Okay. In other parts of the world, primarily the United States and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you have streaming or tracking within the school. So you have students that take a math course that is considered an academic grade 12 calculus course, and that will allow them to apply to university, as opposed to another student taking a grade 12 applied math course, which doesn't allow them to actually apply to university. So this idea of system features, a very strong one that is correlated with negative migrant student outcomes, is early tracking. Early tracking means that you're dividing students into separate groups at an early age for different pathways. What we know about tracking is there's two general things we know overall cross-nationally. One, earlier tracking leads to lower national achievement and greater achievement gaps between high and low SES, immigrants and non-immigrants. It doesn't take a genius to probably figure out that immigrant students and their parents don't have as much cultural capital as non-immigrant parents, and they could be streamed or tracked into lower ability tracks unfairly. Okay. So that would be an example. And then, of course, as you move down this slide, what you're seeing is a greater focus on macro level issues. So we can think of micro, meaning family characteristics, meso, system features, and macro, sort of social protection programs that exist in a country. It's probably shouldn't shock you that, Sweden was quite high, right? Because they have a strong they have strong social protection programs in that country, a strong social welfare system. But, Sweden's an interesting context. I just finished writing an article. It's under review in a British journal. But one thing about the Swedish context is they've increasingly introduced school choice features, right? And school choice is another example of a policy approach cross-nationally, internationally, that tends to be associated with lower achievement outcomes, primarily because school choice is it's driven quite strongly by socioeconomic status, right? So if you go to the United Kingdom and the academies, and I've had colleagues, in the UK write about this, and in fact, one is writing a chapter in my book from UCL, talking about how the increase in academies within the United Kingdom has created more inequity in more between school differences. From a statistical point of view, what we'd like to see from a statistical point of view is we'd like to see more within school variation than between school variation. What I mean by that is I'd ideally like to see schools within a country that have high and low SES within the school and high or range of achievement within the school, as opposed to two different schools, one high SES, one low SES, one high achievement, one low achievement. So it's not, the OECD has several reports in this area. And what they find is that if you have more than 25% immigrant students in a school, achievement tends to be low. However, if you control for socioeconomic status, there's no effect. So what that tells us, it's the concentration of poverty in school that tends to be associated with lower achievement outcomes cross-nationally. And that seems to be a pretty robust finding. So you could look at a number of different countries. So Poland or Hungary or, France or Italy or Germany or the Netherlands all seem to have a very similar sort of path approach in terms of the achievement outcomes. I will finish and then leave time for questions, correct? Is that all right? So if you're looking at this and something isn't, just jot it down and give so that I can come back to it later on. But, income inequality, of course, the more inequity in a system, the more you tend to see lower achievement outcomes for immigrant students. Now, pandemic disruptions is probably the one that we obviously don't know as much about. We don't know exactly what has been the impact of, students shifting online during the pandemic? Well, we're starting to, and I'm going to talk about what we do know and what we don't know. Well, one thing we know is immigrant students were less likely to avail themselves or have availability to the type of technology that was needed during hybrid and online learning situations. And that actually isn't from the OECD. That's actually a large report that was just very recently published by UNESCO. So when we talk about, pandemic related disruptions, what we're really focusing on is learning loss. Now, there's a lot of debate around this term, loss, right? But essentially what they're doing when they're looking at learning loss is they're looking at the last 5 years pre-pandemic overall achievement within a country. Okay, so you can look at it in relation to national administrative data or international test data. Now, we don't have international test data yet because we have PISA 2018 was pre-pandemic and PISA 2022, where the results will be released either December 4th, 5th, or 6th of this year. Once that data is released, we'll have a very good idea cross-nationally of what the actual impact has been of the pandemic on student achievement outcomes for different groups of students. So we'll have much more granular data available. So what we're confined to right now is using national administrative data, meaning, as an example, in Italy, they have Invalsi tests that are done. There's standardized tests across the country, right? And, if you go to different parts of the world, there are national assessments that are done. Now, we have to take all of these results with a little bit of grain of salt, and I'll tell you why. Number one, the mode of instruction changed. So changes in student achievement outcomes could also be tied to the mode of instruction. So even without a pandemic, if students are in front of a computer, they might learn differently than if they're in a classroom. That's number one. Number two, we know from previous research, interesting differences. So as an example, there's gender differences suggest that if you give the exact same test question to boys and girls, initially, if it was paper and pencil, you'd see greater gaps than if it was in using a tablet. Boys tend to do a little bit better when you put a tablet in front of them. And I know this through my own personal experience. I have a boy and a girl. I could definitely see why that I have a very small sample size, N of 2, but I'm telling you, if you get a picture of my son with a book, I'll give you $1,000, okay? Like a paper book, right? But in front of a tablet, no problem to read, right? So there's that marked sort of somewhat of a gender preference in terms of reading has an interesting impact. But some of the research that is starting to emerge, and the work done in Belgium is done by Christophe de Witt at the University of Leuven, and he was one of the first to actually publish a study looking at academic learning losses. And here what you're seeing is, once again, you're seeing lower overall achievement, but the important part here, I think, at least in terms of migrant students, is there's greater between school differences. And based on demographics, we know that immigrant students tend to be concentrated in particular types of schools. So that is something to keep an eye on. The last bullet shows you some other studies that have emerged in the Netherlands, Germany, the United States. They're all pointing to the exact same thing. The best a country has done thus far from what we have right now in terms of the data is learning stalled, meaning there wasn't much loss, but there weren't any gains. The worst case scenario is students actually regressed. Okay, so people are always asked, the question I always get asked is, well, what's the percentage difference? Like, how much have they dropped? If you had to, don't give us fancy statistics with, standard deviations. What do you think it is? Most research is suggesting around 20% per year was lost in terms of curriculum expectations, curriculum content, learning outcomes, at least in the the subject areas that are most likely to be assessed, which are the core traditional subject areas of reading, math, science, okay? We don't have good data in other parts of the curriculum. But as a general rule, we know like physical health outcomes, now we're starting to move into a discussion of non-cognitive. Physical health outcomes are quite poor. In fact, as an example, I'll give you one from my own home province, 13.5 million students. The 11 to 15-year-olds, less than 5% of those kids got the recommended daily physical activity during the pandemic. For 15-year-olds and higher, it was less than 1%. So the impact of the pandemic being closed in, and we had the longest school closure. We had the longest school closure in the world in terms of total number of weeks. So our data probably won't look so good when it's actually released. So I've talked a little bit about this difference between cognitive and non-cognitive. Some more recent data is starting to emerge tied to immigrant students during the pandemic that is showing the non-cognitive gaps are bigger than the cognitive ones, meaning that in addition to what you just previously saw in terms of, 7% greater between school differences for achievement outcomes, you're seeing even they're further at risk when it comes to non-cognitive. So if you look at the typical sort of scaled score for PISA, it's around 500. So if the average Italian student is 500 and the average German student is 530, these aren't real numbers, by the way, that would mean that the average 15-year-old in Germany is one grade level above the average 15-year-old in Italy. 30 scale points, more or less, is equivalent to one age grade level, okay? And that number is important because, 15 is half a grade level. When you look at some of the Eurodice data, the differences between immigrant and non-immigrant students can be as much as 80 scaled points. So Finland, as an example, has high achievement in reading, math, and science, but their immigrant students within the European Union tend to be the worst. So you have a very homogeneous student population there. You have quite poor educational outcomes for those immigrant students. This is really important because, at least in the field of education, we tend to put a country like Finland, which has done really, really well, at least when you look at international test data in terms of overall outcomes. But when you disaggregate that data and look at it at a closer level, you tend to find, at least when it comes to immigrant students, greater differences. The UK actually is one of the few countries that almost doesn't have a performance disadvantage, meaning their immigrant students don't achieve much lower than their non-immigrants. There are only a couple of countries, by the way, in the world where immigrant students outperform non-immigrant students. We call it a performance advantage. In Canada, it's about a grade level. Our immigrant students outperform our non-immigrant students. Now, immigrant parents tend to be very highly educated, and the data that we have shows that on average, the average immigrant parent has more education than the non-immigrant parents. So we can't just say, by the way, we have this amazing education system and these policies that are in place. We also have to control for those background characteristics as well. So I've talked a little bit about some of these features. I mentioned early tracking and school choice. I think the one that probably I'd like to mention as well is the non-weighted funding formulas. So countries that tend to have more equity tend to have a weighted system, meaning more resources, more money goes to schools with high immigrant student populations so that they have those resources so that they can actually integrate and do well within the education systems. Fixed funding formulas, meaning every school is going to get the same amount of money regardless of the school characteristics or the background student characteristics, tend to have more inequity. So this idea of fairness, giving everybody the same actually creates more inequity in the system. So a weighted funding formula is absolutely essential, but it's also politically very difficult to do in certain national contexts, particularly those with anti-immigrant sentiment. They don't want to have more resources going to those schools. They want to have less. From a financial point of view, immigrant students are going to be more likely to graduate from high school or secondary school if those supports are present. Now, I'll give you an example from Canada. If we raise our high school graduation rate from 92 to 93%, 1 percentage point saves over $7 billion in long-term costs every year, not, for the life of the student, because there's direct costs and indirect. The person who graduates from high school makes 25% more money and contributes more money to the taxation base. The student who doesn't graduate from high school, more likely to become ill, have less balanced diet, avail themselves of the healthcare system more. So there's all these direct and indirect costs. Of course, it's not surprising. Students who don't graduate from high school are more likely to be incarcerated than those that aren't. So we can do an analysis that looks at this. So school completion is quite important. We're talking about achievement outcomes here, right? Just like, how well they're doing. But we also need to keep that in mind, that overall outcomes should be tempered by the fact that we're also interested in school completion. And then, of course, this idea of rigid primary and secondary pathways where students are tracked quite early into a system. In terms of catch-up policies, that's probably, something that we're starting to understand. What are some things that we can do for students who've suffered through a couple of years of the pandemic, might have been more isolated? And what we're finding, though, that is a very strong focus on cognitive curriculum expectation outcomes can be quite, can actually work against us, right? So I published an article talking about, learning loss, the learning loss dilemma. That's the actual title of the article, catching up only to fall behind, because students could catch up academically, but we could see greater problems in terms of those non-cognitive things like anxiety, depression, social emotional learning, lower growth mindset. Growth mindset, I don't know if you've ever heard that concept, but growth mindset is the idea, and we measure this cross-nationally. Growth mindset is the idea that a student who has a high growth mindset means that, they might not be a math person, but they feel that if they put the effort into math, that they'll be successful, as opposed to I'm good at math or I'm not good at math. We know growth mindset varies significantly across countries, right? And it's positively correlated with both cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes. So, how do you promote a growth mindset in students in the sense that they feel, and that's that idea of grit. We talk about resilience, but the literature is more established in this field when they use the term grit, meaning, perseverance, struggle through it a little bit. And if you put the effort in, you'll be successful. So we're also thinking about, how do things like growth mindset get impacted for immigrant students based on certain education policies that could be in place? So does early tracking depress growth mindset, which in part would then have a negative impact on things like non-cognitive learning outcomes? I know the focus is on the European Union, and I definitely can speak to the EU. That's not a problem. But I wanted to give you an example of what resilience could look like if you were to do a similar analysis in different European countries. This is the one that I did in Canada. It took a year, 200 policy documents across 10 provinces. And essentially, these are the key characteristics that governments, all 10 governments across Canada, focused on in terms of academic, physical health and well-being, and mental health support. That's why it's called triarctic, because what you have on the left side is the cognitive, and on the right side, those two features are non-cognitive. okay? And these are the types of policies that were developed during the pandemic to support students. And then, of course, within those policies, there are specific features geared towards immigrant students as well, okay? So I mean, if you're interested in this paper, just shoot me an email. It's open access. You can get access to it. It's the Canadian Journal of Education, which is our flagship journal. The last thing I'll mention before I leave time for some questions is the piece of work that I'm working on right now. This is a book that will be published by the European Commission. Silke is at the Joint Research Center in Ispra, which is just north of Milan, close to Lake Maggiore. I don't know if you're familiar with the JRC, but it's the third largest office of the European Commission. I work closely with Silke. I think this is our fourth book together, and I spent some time. I'm primarily in the modeling and impact evaluation unit there with her when we do work together. Don is the dean at the University of Waikato, and Orazio Giancola and Luca Salmieri are two professors at Sapienza in Rome. And I just wanted to show you the individuals that are contributing to this book, but essentially what this book will do is take a look at academic learning losses across these 8 European jurisdictions. Now, you're probably wondering why these 8, why not, why isn't so-and-so included? A couple of key points. Number one, during the pandemic, not all countries actually collected administrative data because, they didn't have resources, or it was too difficult to actually run a standardized test at a distance. And there's various issues at play with that. So these are the countries that were chosen because number one, they have the administrative data. And number two, there is some opportunity to run a counterfactual impact evaluation. Now, what's a counterfactual impact evaluation? Really what that means is we're trying to isolate the impact of a policy in a group of students that were receivers of that policy versus students that weren't exposed to that policy. Counterfactual impact evaluation is very, very difficult to do because as a general rule of thumb, when a country or a region unveils a policy, it's for all of their students, right? So you need that control group, so to speak, to run a counterfactual, to be able to have data that compares students that were exposed to the policy versus those that weren't. Okay, there's 2 ways to do that. Number one, the best way to do it, and governments don't do it, is to pilot test a policy in a smaller group of schools before they unveil it. They don't do that for political reasons. Politicians are, as a general rule of thumb, elected for 3, 4, 5 years. In Italy, a lot less than 5 years. But, so they're typically trying to put their stamp on a portfolio quite quickly. It would be nice if they actually ran a pilot to see how that policy works, not only if they want to adopt it, but also modify it and improve it. Okay, so that is sort of a plea that we tend to, give policymakers in Brussels is, think about that opportunity first. Number two, there are places that you can look at differences across jurisdictions. So as an example, the German context, there's Länder. I'm not pronouncing it right. Essentially, those are different regions, right? Like there's different regions in Italy where there might be a particular policy in place, but not in another. So that presents an opportunity to run a counterfactual impact evaluation. I'm not promising that all 8 chapters will do this. Some will do it to a greater extent than others, but that is one of the key things that we're trying to do with this book in order to isolate those policies that we feel have had a more pronounced effect. In Italian, we say buona notizia. So before I left here, I got una buona notizia. So I was funded for another 6 years to study this in the Canadian context. And it goes from 2023 to 2029. And I'll be able to look at short as well as long-term impacts of the pandemic on student outcomes, both cognitive and non-cognitive, across all 10 provinces. And I'll be able to, hopefully in 6 years from now, be able to say, in God forbid, I never ever want to see another pandemic for the rest of my life. But if we did, what are some policies that are more beneficial for students during what we call, emergency remote learning? Okay, so I think I'll stop there. And these are some of the references that I used during the presentation. There's more that I can provide, but these are the main ones that I've drawn on. Okay, some are from journals, some are from, by the way, the first one just got published literally 2-3 weeks ago. It was just posted online, so it's open access.
Thank you very much, Louis. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. So now I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. And I would like also to remind our viewers online on YouTube that you can also post questions and comment you might have for Louis online in the chat box on YouTube directly, and we can read them out here. So I open the floor now. So I see Herman, Julia, and then, so I think we are going to collect around 3 questions, and then you can answer all of them at the same time. So Herman, please.
Thank you. This was very interesting and very nice overview of all the different factors that play a role in understanding inequalities, also in the pandemic, but also independent of the pandemic. I have a question about the concept of resilience. So I've seen some studies from the OECD when it comes to PISA, but also more broadly in the political field. I think, at least in the Netherlands where I'm from, there's this use of resilience that is somewhat confusing to me. So namely, resilience is then operationalized as some sort of quite high achievement of a certain group in the international distribution. So, for instance, when the migrants in the Netherlands score pretty well on PISA, this is considered as a resilient group in that sense. They do well in comparison to the overall PISA distribution. However, what it doesn't do in that regard, so I was wondering how you look at this empirically, but also conceptually. Okay. What it doesn't do is to compare migrants and non-migrants within the same country. And for me, that would be a way more important understanding of inequalities. So even if the Dutch migrants, the migrants in the Netherlands, do pretty well, they do well because the whole country is doing pretty well in PISA. But the gaps are in fact not so small if you look at the comparison between the migrants and the non-migrants in the Netherlands. So I was just wondering how you look at resilience as a concept.
Can I answer that question? So no, it's a great question. I think she mentioned it. I have a secondary appointment in Maastricht University. A colleague of mine, Mindel van der Laar, and I are currently working on exactly what you're talking about. So we're trying to understand how different countries around the world are operationally defining resilience, more so for higher education, at the higher education level. But it speaks to what you said at the very beginning of your question, which is, it's a pretty muddy kind of concept, and it means different things to different people. So when you're comparing across countries, you could be comparing apples to oranges. But if you're talking about the Dutch context in particular, yeah, there are, the Dutch students in general score quite well, and there are smaller gaps. But if you're talking about at a more granular level, looking at maybe differences between, Utrecht and Maastricht or Eindhoven, that data does exist. A colleague of mine, he recently passed away. Well, not recently, at the beginning of COVID. You might know him. His name was Jaap Schierens. He actually spent about 10 years here at the EUI. He's done some work, and he has some published work in this area as well that you can draw upon. And I think one of the citations that you saw in the reference list, you would have access to Yap's article. Well, actually, that article in particular was across the entire European Union. So you know, he used a pretty broad data set. But you know, to go back to your original point, I'm trying to figure that out as we speak. We've actually done the first part, and we're mining the data a little bit more and going through it a little bit more closely. But we're in the process of writing an article exactly about this issue. Once again, though, more for higher education. How it's conceptualized differently across countries, and how that conceptualization also impacts the supports and programs that are developed in relation to it. Because if you have a different sort of operational definition for what resilience is, then that would lead to different approaches to enhancing it, right? So as you know, if you don't include non-cognitive, then mental health supports won't be part of your approach, right?
Let me just briefly make an additional comment on this. So I mean, it's important to have conceptual clarity, I think, in this regard, because, you know, I mean, this is a Migration Policy Center seminar. Policymakers and politicians jump on the right definition that you know, in which their country looks nice, honestly. So Dutch Minister of Education was, you know, some PISA rounds ago, extremely, you know, cheerful that our migrants were so resilient, ignoring the fact that the gap with the majority population was in fact quite large. But, you know, it was resilient because in the international distribution, the migrants do much better than migrants in other countries, let's say.
But they're well aware of those differences. They're well aware of those differences within those three populations I spoke about, right? So, you know, they do know if there's gaps between boys and girls. They do know if there's gaps between wealthy and non-wealthy students, or high and low SES. And they do know what the exact gaps are between non-immigrant and first and second generation students. So that data is well there. It's a question of gaze, where you focus someone's gaze, right? Like that camera could be focusing on a particular aspect of the data. Give them a lot more credit than you're giving them. You know, my experiences taught me that they're not unaware of those differences.
Well, this is the way I come to present it.
Of course. Yeah. Well, now you're talking about the relation between policy and politics, right? Yeah. And I'm very interested in that relationship. I published a paper in the European, it's called European Education, talking exactly about these differences. And I used Italy, France, and Estonia as 3 case examples of how policy was manifested different in relation to those political considerations.
Okay, so Julian.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a short question. Is there a difference, or do you address this difference in your research between migrant, like voluntary migrants and refugees? Is there any gap that you see?
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about would be great if we could actually have an identifier for that. My graduate student in Maastricht did her thesis on refugee students in particular. And of course, in the general literature, we make a distinction between voluntary and involuntary migrants. So as a simple rule of thumb, as an example, is voluntary migrants tend to have a double disadvantage, right? They tend to be low SES, and their parents often don't have high education levels. But refugee students, and I published using this term, it's not just me, but other people use this term, they refer to it as a triple disadvantage, because in addition to what I just described, many involuntary migrants also come to a country with a lot of psychosocial concerns, right? If you're coming from a war-torn country, you could be exposed. And we have data that shows that those involuntary migrants are more likely to have PTSD, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, like in my own country, as an example, we took a lot of students, a lot of children from Syria are in Canadian schools now. And of course, those children had additional concerns that, you know, went beyond just socioeconomic status and you know, having access to resources. So yes, the research is fairly clear on that. And there is data, there are studies in this area, but we don't have really good studies that are cross-national that are as complex, because we don't have identifier, we don't have individual student identifiers that we could take them as a subset of the population. You know, if you're talking about a sample of, you know, 100,000 or 200,000 students. So that would be something that could help.
Andrew.
Migration, and we can talk about anti-migration sentiment, and guess there's also pro-migration sentiment as well. And I was interested in perhaps in past work and in current work. Oh, sorry. For those on, I think I wanted to ask a little bit about attitudes to migration, the effect they could have. Because it seems to me that during the pandemic, the kind of salience of the migration issue means greatly also because we have a bit of concerns. And we've done some work to show that attitude towards migration across most of the countries are studying have become more favourable over the last 20, 30 years or so, quite significantly. There's some variation, but I think it's quite an important trend. But I can also imagine in the classroom, there'll be very specific effects. Perhaps there might be interventions to try and tackle the effects of anti-migration sentiment.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how, through the work that you do, you would account for this maybe more systemic level factor and its impact in the classroom.
Yeah, it's
they kind of particular effects, but generally I think migration is favourable. But I'd be interested about that. And also just a quick follow-up to the information really. What impact did this have on the pandemic have on the training of teachers? Because I can imagine that might also, maybe if you're late to work, has some effect because of the way in which teachers were trained, or it was pandemic disruption.
It varies across, yeah, it varies across countries, because I mean, some countries and some jurisdictions have brought in new sort of curriculum expectations tied to things like an enhanced approach to mental health, you know, so that whole issue around the non-cognitive. Of course, there's always the traditional stuff in terms of, you know, how can you teach, you know, using a computer and synchronous learning. That was always there. But I want to go back to your earlier question, and then I think I'll move forward if that's okay. So you're asking about attitudes. So, you know, I'm a mixed methods researcher. I use quantitative and qualitative. That type of question is ideally answered by a qualitative approach, because you get richer data by interviewing the students, interviewing families, interviewing teachers. But of course, that's difficult to do cross-nationally, right? It's too expensive, and it's very, very difficult to do. So we're often dependent on the surveys that are attached to these large-scale assessments, whether it's PISA or TIMSS or PEARLS. And then, of course, you know, it presents an opportunity, but there's also constraints, because, you know, we can only collect data based on, we can only compare cross-nationally in terms of attitudes in relation to those types of questions that are asked. So as an example, let's go with sense of belonging. In education, we look at something like sense of belonging, which is a proxy for whether the student has a positive attitude towards school, feels safe in it. You know, we do know that students have a greater sense of belonging in schools that are more have a more pro sort of lens in terms of diversity within that school, right? And then, of course, that also can be conflated by the fact that, you know, the more heterogeneous the student population is, the more likely you are going to find students that are less likely to report sort of feeling more negative around that context. So it's very, very at least what I'm mostly concerned in is trying to isolate a policy and that impact of that policy. So in terms of overall attitudes, we rely on those surveys. They're not great in the sense that, there's lots of things that we would like to sort of delve into. But the longitudinal research that I've done that's been mixed methods can, where I actually interview teachers and interview school leaders, can more closely delve into this issue around attitudes. So like an interesting sort of cross-national sort of result that we tend to find, at least in Western English-speaking jurisdictions, is students in the suburbs tend to be the highest achievers, right? Second comes students in the cities. And third is more rural students. Where immigrants you tend to find more first and second generation immigrants in cities, less likely in the rural areas. Actually, the only exception to this achievement rule is the Netherlands, where rural students outperform everyone. At least the last data that I looked at. But, so there's all these sort of conflating sort of issues at play here, because going back to my earlier point, if you have more than 25% immigrant students in a school, you'd expect to see lower overall achievement. But if you control for SES, that seems to flatten out. So, but more immigrant students in a school, more likely those students are going to report feeling a sense of belonging, right? But even sense of belonging kind of is buttressed by other things. So there could be more bullying in that particular school. So, that general rule, though, that immigrants, overall, the general rule applies. Immigrant students are far more likely to be bullied or report bullying. Let's just say report bullying than non-immigrant students, right? I hope I answered. I know it's a tricky question. You want me to?
But we have a question from Matteo as well.
I could see the questions. Oh, no, it was just the 4 comments were just about Andrew.
No, please, but there are, okay.
Yes, okay, well, first of all, thanks a lot for your presentation, and it's really like, I find your findings really interesting, and I think they could have a great potential as policy drivers. I have 2 questions actually, which relate a bit less on the findings and more on 2 concepts. The first of the concept of immigrant that you use, and also the concept of integration.
The first concept was
immigrant.
Oh,
I explained it better.
okay.
You often mention first generation, second generation immigrants, but don't you think that labeling a person as second generation immigrant, for example, a person that has not immigrated at all in practice, because they've born already in that country and never moved from that country normally. Don't you think that labeling a person like this would have some sort of discriminatory connotation already? And in relation to this, I mean, when does a person then stop being an immigrant, if you consider them first generation, second generation, third generation immigrants? And my second question relates to the concept of integration. That is, how do you measure integration? Do you only consider integration as an individual path of an immigrant towards assimilating themselves to the receiving society? Or do you frame integration also as an effort and not some specific, indicators from the sides of the members of the receiving society also? Thanks.
So do you want me to, can I do the second question first? Is that okay? So no, obviously I don't think of assimilation as proper integration, right? I mean, I think of integration as an ability, and I'm biased here because I come from a country that has a very strict, well, not strict, but very strong multicultural approach where assimilation is not valued, where it's about accommodation. But, those are traditional sort of receiving countries, host countries tend to have a more accommodative approach. So if you're asking me whether I think assimilation is the way we look at integration, no, I can't speak for MyPEX. I know Ozge is someone I published with, and think she was in one, I don't think I had her in a citation, but she was one of the individuals that worked on the MyPEX data. So you can take a closer look at that if you want to see, exactly how they've decided whether, those scores map onto the approach that you're referring to. But as a general rule of thumb, no, I wouldn't say assimilation is the way I'd consider a student being integrated. Now, your first question was around, how you classify immigrant students. I mean, first and generation, sort of classifying as a first and second generation student, I'll be honest with you, does make some sense, at least in terms of educational programs, because we expect certain students, particularly when it comes to moving from one country to another where the language of instruction is different. And it shouldn't surprise you that if you're moving to a like-minded, so from one country to another with a similar language, that you'd have an easier time. Now, I didn't come up with this sort of dichotomy between first and second generation. I think all the international test associations use this, collect the data this way. But from a policy point of view, it is helpful to have that sort of class. It's not a classification, because really most countries that do a good job, they're not really concerned with first or second generation. Often when a student goes to a country, they're assessed in terms of language, and they're usually given essentially a factor. So 0.0 means that they're ready to be quote unquote integrated into a regular classroom 100% of the time. 1.0 means that they're on a withdrawal in a special classroom with more resources, a teacher who could teach English as a second language or Italian as a second language. They're not native language learners. So the ideal is to go from 1.0 to 0 as quickly as possible for all of those non-cognitive reasons, right? For all those social integration reasons. So if you're talking about how school systems use it, they're not as much concerned about first and second generation as researchers are. School systems are more concerned around how that transition from the host country to the receiving country, how that could be more smoothly done. And typically the language assessment is one of the first things. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm happy to take a follow-up.
Yeah, maybe just a quick follow-up. Yeah, I mean, my observation, my questions are not specifically directed to you, but of course are just trying to emphasize the fact that, I mean, once even an economics scholar in their research, they use terms and categories like immigrants or integration, and then they say that second generation immigrants do not integrate as well as other people. There is already kind of a bias there, because it's already the first bias that is considering a person that is second generation immigrant who has never moved from that country, as actually was born there as an immigrant. And the second bias is the fact of considering integration as a person that needs to be integrated into another society, that in practice is assimilation, because they just need to acquire, I don't know, language skills of the host society.
Yeah, I understand.
While instead considering other aspects, for example, I don't know, the attitudes of the receiving society towards these persons should be also considered as integration. And then you don't consider a person as needed to be integrated, but then you consider integration as a process that involves both parts.
So I agree
Just
with
that.
you. I agree with the overall point, but one thing the data doesn't do quite well, especially for those second generation immigrants, is those cyclical and return migration processes. So we do have some students that are born in the country, so they're quote unquote second generation, but leave, come back, leave, come back. So from that point of view, I understand if you're talking about a static approach where I'm a perfect example of what you're describing. I'm born in Toronto, I'm second generation. What do I need to immigrate for? I mean, it's my country, right? I was born and raised there. But many, particularly in the countries that I just showed you, traditional receiving countries more recently are often, and the data doesn't capture this, and I talk about this in some articles, is that we don't have good data on the students that leave and come back and leave and come back, because they might need particular supports because of gaps, right? There's gaps. Look, my wife's a school teacher. She teaches grade 6, 7, so 12, 13-year-olds. She has some students that leave for 2 months at a time and come back. They're gone for 3 months. Back to their home country where English is not their language of instruction. That would be a perfect example of, a situation where the student is quote unquote second generation, but likely to experience gaps in their learning just because of, it's not uncommon actually. In my city, it's not uncommon. What I just described is not an uncommon phenomenon, right? But I agree with your overall point, though.
So we also have some questions from our Deputy Director, Martin Roos, who is watching online. So I'm going to read them. The first one is actually going into the direction of the question Matteo was asking, because it asks, how is immigrant defined in all this analysis? Is it a foreign born or foreign national? And the second question is there an independent immigrant effect in outcomes? So in the analysis of the effects of the pandemic after controlling for other characteristics, such as the socioeconomic background and so on. If so, what explains this independent effect?
Okay, so for a foreign born, it would be the way the OECD would be looking at. So you're born in another country and you immigrate. That would be your first generation. That's their approach. But the independent effect question is an interesting one. Once again, I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm going to answer it as best I can. It is largely dependent on national administrative data, which means that you're using, as an example, InvalSea data, or you're using data such as the A-level exams. In England, as an example, they had, calculated grades that they played around with. So we're not, there is an effect for immigrant students. What is the impact of that effect when you exclude or hold constant socioeconomic status? That's essentially the issue here, right? So if you hold socioeconomic status constant, what is the effect of being an immigrant student in terms of your educational outcomes? It could be as much as nothing to as much as 80 scaled points, 2.5 grade levels. And it's that large. I will tell you there's greater variability usually within a country than between countries. So if I look at the difference, even the example that I gave you between the Netherlands and Germany, there is differences, but there's more variability within the Netherlands and within Germany than there is between those countries. So that tells you that there's quite a bit of work that we can be doing within a country to flatten or sort of create a more equitable experience for students. Even a non-European country like Canada, we have 2.5 grade level differences within our country from one province to the next. So there's significant differences that exist. If we could, going back to an earlier question, if we could somehow isolate refugee students from first and second generation immigrant, We do know from other research that they're more likely to have greater challenges. In education, we say at risk. They're more at risk. So what are at-risk populations? You know, immigrant students, low SES, students in inner city schools with less access to resources. There's a variety of at-risk factors. The question is, when it comes to immigrant students, they tend to be, there's that sort of, they're correlated. All of these other issues tend to be related to one another. And it's very difficult. Like, as an example, can you ever find an example of a refugee population that isn't low SES and compare it to those that are high SES? It's very difficult to do, right? So in order for me to isolate the impact of refugee status minus the socioeconomic status, ideally I'd need a range. I'd need a range of refugee students that are wealthy and refugee students that are not wealthy. Going back to, you know, that idea, and then tied to a counterfactual impact evaluation, those two groups, it's a 2x2 analysis. Two groups, high SES and low SES, refugee and non-refugee, exposed to a policy, one group, and those two groups exposed to a policy, another two groups, low SES and high SES refugees, not exposed to a policy, to isolate that impact. I'll take a follow-up. I don't know if I answered the question.
We will see if Martin writes. I also have a question myself. Two questions, actually. So one thing was that, as you told us, and I think also Herman's work shows this, that countries with early tracking school systems tend to have kind of more disadvantages for already lower income students or immigrant students. So the kind of provocative question would be, why do we still observe so many countries that tend to do early tracking systems, if this is pretty shown? And the second question is more related to the COVID pandemic. So is it possible that we will see some a paradoxical situation, because we do know that parents with a higher socioeconomic status, of course, their children tend to do better at school, and usually this is explained because they have more time and more resources and so on. So is it possible that during COVID, we have actually paradoxically observed a little bit of the opposite, because parents who, and I'm simplifying here, maybe normally work in factories which were closed, so were at home and had much more time for their own children, whereas parents who tend to have a higher socioeconomic status occupation were actually working remotely, so they tended to have less time for their children. So is that possible?
We'll see. I mean, I see your point. We'll see if that happens. I think overall, though, I think you'll still see a general trend, because I do know for a fact the anecdotal stuff and some of the smaller scale stuff that's come out has showed, you know, still low SES parents that work in factories don't necessarily have that technological literacy. They don't have the, you know, as much fluency in the language of instruction to provide that sort of one-on-one support. But, you know, that remains an open question. I think if we were to sort of look at that question, we'd also need data, or at least some sort of survey that would be able to identify that. It's going to be very, very difficult to do cross-nationally. I think you could do that type of study, but it would have to be mixed methods, and you'd have to be purposefully, you would need a purposeful we call it purposeful selective sampling. You probably heard that expression, right? So basically a stratified, not random, stratified purposeful sample, meaning I'm going to follow 100 children, 50 are factory workers, to use your example, 50 are working class, white collar working class children. And I'm going to interview the kids and the parents, and I'm going to have a good sense of the type of support they were provided to be able to see, was there an inverse relation that we weren't anticipating that could have existed. Now, your first question was around tracking. Why do they still do it? Well, countries have a long history of the structure of their school system. If you're curious, you can Google not now, but in a, you know, when we're done this presentation, you can Google OECD GPS. And when you go to that website, you can click on any country and it'll show you the structure from primary school to secondary to post-secondary. It gives you a nice sort of diagram of every single country's education system. Why am I mentioning that? Well, if you were to look at that and then look at it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, probably looking at the exact same graph. The most difficult thing to change in an education system is the structure. Policies can change because governments come in every 3, 4, 5 years and they change the policies, but they're often married to this. And the idea of tracking, why do it if we know that? And let me just, I'm not correcting you, but let me add to this. We know overall, not just immigrant students, overall early tracking leads to overall lower achievement cross-nationally and bigger gaps, okay? Why do it? Certain groups of students still benefit from tracking, right? Let's be fair. It's a self-selected group that tend to get into those the most prestigious, you know, tracks and schools. So it's, you know, there's tracking as one form of self-selection, but then there's also school selection that takes place. So you have tracking, but then in addition to tracking, I'm sure there's certain lyceos that are more prestigious to go to school to than others. So tracking is essentially a precursor for a strong school selection process. And countries that have high levels of school choice tend to have lower overall achievement, right? I could mention 2 countries that have a very, very strong tradition of school choice, right? England and the United States. Yes. Overall, yeah. Overall, though, as a general rule of thumb, countries that have a strong tradition of tracking don't do well overall, right?
Can I add something to this? I mean, so with regard to tracking, I think I'm fully online on your side. So I think indeed that certainly in comparative research, there's no evidence for any gain of tracking in that sense, right? Maybe not even at the top, actually, because if you look at the top, those who benefit from those more prestigious tracks are the ones who not go there, actually. So if there was different sorting going on, even those track systems would be even more efficient or optimizing. But with regard to school choice, I'm not so sure, actually. So, and this brings me to a broader issue when it comes to these the relevance of these policy measures. It might be quite difficult to change policies because there might be pluses and minuses, actually. So there are trade-offs. And with regard to school choice, I think there's also evidence saying that school choice brings in competition. And this economic model has, in fact, positive average effects, even if the gaps are larger, right? So that's a clear trade-off. There's a larger inequality, that's a minus. There's a greater average achievement, that's a plus. And policymakers have to balance these kinds of pluses and minuses, I think.
Yeah, but if you're talking about at-risk student populations, okay, let's look at the logical conclusion to school choice. Okay, I live in this town, but the best school is 30 minutes away. I'm a single mother. I have to be at work at 8 o'clock in the morning. Do I really have the choice to send my son or daughter to a school on the other part of the city? Right? So, I mean, I'm giving you a very extreme example, but there's even far more pronounced examples. As an example, Detroit. They were putting kids on buses for a 2-hour bus ride out of the city to go to quote unquote better schools.
Therefore, the inequality effects are clear, obvious, right? More inequality in school choice settings.
Yeah.
But it might be that if we don't talk about at-risk students, but more generally about the average student, let's say, they might gain, even in that system that is unfair when it comes to inequality.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with you. I'm not that I'm very Canadian. I never disagree directly with people, but I feel strongly about the school choice issue. I've written about it, and competition as a general rule. We cannot treat schools like sort of. We can't treat schools don't let me put it another way. Schools don't react well to market-based principles. Competition between schools, there's no incentive for one teacher in one school to share best practices, pedagogical approaches that worked in their school with a teacher from another school, or even within a school when you create competition. So I'm using more extreme examples than you would find in the Netherlands. So charter schools, voucher schools, academies, etc. Competition, it's collaboration that leads to overall system effectiveness, not competition.
I'm going to make my point clear. I'm not making the case for school choice at all. That's not my point. My point is that a policymaker that has to design policies might have to deal with the fact that there are some arguments in favor of school choice, even if the negative effects of marketization are totally clear to me. And that positive effect has been shown empirically, this is not about my norms or my values about certain school systems. Empirical facts, as far as I understand some studies, show that in PISA data, competition works actually for the average performance. It might increase inequalities and have all kinds of negative effects that would make me as critical to school choice policies as you maybe, but that fact is there.
Yeah, the OECD has a policy brief. If you're interested, there's over 120 of them. It's called PISA in Focus. So you can Google it. They are a little bit more sort of, they're not as strong as I am on this issue, but overall they feel they've concluded that school choice and competition within schools tends to create greater there's greater social differences across schools. It tends to result in greater social and cultural differences across schools. So, I think that's the issue that I have, that on paper, it's a great idea, but in practice, what other issues tend to be manifested when it comes to things like school choice? But it's a very tricky issue, right? Because school choice means different things across different countries as well.
No, my point was more to understand why ineffective systems systems that might seem ineffective, like early tracking. I've worked a lot on early tracking. The reason why they might still persist is in fact that it might benefit some kids. And in fact, as a cynical, let's say, sociologist, which I am, I'm not a cynical sociologist, but I'm a sociologist. If you would have a cynical view on these matters, these are the kids of the policymakers actually who benefit from tracking.
Yeah, no,
I've been to Dutch Ministry of Education, talked to policymakers, like top civil servants on education policy. And their anecdotal evidence of their sons and daughters going to certain schools, it's just striking as a source of evidence for them, honestly. So I'm a bit cynical about that.
Yeah.
But the point is that there could be pluses and minuses, and even if it's not true, it's in the heads of the people that are dealing with it, and that calls for stability.
So can I make one final comment on this?
Very, very short, because I'm
Okay.
afraid we are at the end of.
Okay, I'm going to make one final comment. I teach a policy and politics course in education. It's a graduate course. And the first class and the last class, I put up a very simple picture for them. On one end, I have opinion-based policies. In the middle, I have evidence-informed policies. And on the other extreme end, I have evidence-based policies. There's very, very few governments, if any, that make policy decisions that are evidence-based. Good swath in the middle, evidence-informed. And then, of course, we have some bad examples of opinion-based. But the ideal is to move from one end to the other end, right? The other extreme being evidence-based. I've written about this. I've researched this for a long time, 15, 20 years in this particular area. It's very difficult to find an example of a government that is moved by evidence. And by the way, are people moved by evidence? I'm sure some people are going to go out at the break and have a cigarette. They know what they know it's not good for them. The same way a government might know tracking is not good for them. That's not going to stop them from using tracking, right? So I think policymakers, you know, ideally we'd like them to make evidence-based decisions. In education, we talk about this a lot, but the reality is most of the decisions that are made are evidence informed.
Okay, so I'm afraid we have come to the end of our seminar. So thank you very much, Louis, for your very interesting presentation. Thank you very much to the participants here in the room for the engaging discussion. And also thank you everyone who has followed us online. Let me just remind you as the last thing that we are having our next MPC seminar this Wednesday already at 11 o'clock. So thank you very much everyone for your attention and participation, and see you in the next seminar. Bye.
Should I exit?